So the numbers are still slowly climbing, but plateauing off. So we'll make a start. So thank you everyone for joining on this sunny Friday afternoon. Really appreciate your time, and hopefully we won't keep you too long. The webinar is formatted for an hour, so hopefully by 2 o'clock we'll be finished. Sorry, got some extra noise in the background. So before we get started, just some quick introductions. So I'm Dan, I'm the partnership lead from the Land app. Been with the tool for about a year, really keen to show you what we've been developing around the basic payment scheme claim. And I'm delighted to be joined by George and Robbie from Ceres Rural, and I'll let them do an intro in a moment. But just before we start, just some quick overview of the agenda and some housekeeping, which is going to be mainly looking at the basic payment scheme template, but we will be hopefully meandering around the topic. So if George or Robbie, there's any thoughts around wider uses of the Land app, please do bring those up. That could include sustainable farm incentive or farm resilience programs or stewardship, for example. But we hopefully by the end of the webinar we'll really just be showing you what value you can get from using the Land app to try and plan and deliver your basic payment scheme, whether it's for yourself or for a client. There will be a little section in the middle where the guys from Ceres will just give some top tips around the submission of BPS. And then, like I say, looking beyond BPS, the geospatial world is only just in its infancy, and harnessing the power of it now and upskilling yourself as a professional, as a landowner, will hopefully bring you value as we move forward. As usual during these webinars, there is a Q&A function on Zoom. So if there's any questions, please do pop them in the Q&A during. My colleague Tom is in the background, who will be fielding questions that I can put to the panelists at any point, either during or during that final session. So your camera will remain off and you will be muted. So if there's any other points, do let us know in the chat, and feel free to have a conversation in that chat function, but only the questions put in the Q&A will be answered during that Q&A session. Like we said, there will be some time at the end where myself and Tom, and potentially the chaps, as long as George's young child stays asleep until 2 p.m, we'll stay around to answer any questions. Plus there will be a bit of a feedback form as you leave the webinar to ask just a couple of questions around your use of the Land app and your use and role in the sector. So before I go through in a bit more detail the agenda and start the demo, George, would you like to introduce yourself and the organisation you're from?
Yeah, so George Badger, I'm farming consultant with Ceres Rural. I'm based in our Oxford team, but we have 3 offices and 24 farming consultants, sort of based in sort of South and Midlands, really. And I do farm business consultancy, obviously BPS applications, and wider business advice for farmers, and a bit of agronomy as well. So a varied role.
Great, thank you, George, and thanks for joining. I'm sure we'll tap into some of those experiences as we go through. And Robbie.
Yeah, hi everyone, I'm Robbie Brett. I've been with Ceres Rural since September. Previously I was studying at Newcastle University, studying environmental sciences, and also studied for a year in South Korea. And since joining Ceres, I've been heavily involved with the Future Farm Resilience Fund and Farm Business Reviews, which is DEFRA funded project that's sort of helping to replace BPS, helping to advise farmers on how to respond to the changes in subsidies going forward.
Great, well, thanks, Robbie. Really great to have you, and it'll be a nice perspective between, coming in relatively new to the sector and new experiences compared to, George as well. So keen to dive into that. So to kind of start the conversation, really, is what I'd like to do is just cover these 4 main points, George and Robbie, which is I'm going to get the Land app up, and we're going to look at, how you first, come into the Land app, importing your data. And while I'm doing that, if you want to just talk through the process of, how you're currently using the Land app for day-to-day tasks, with a predominant focus on BPS, but also if there's any other thoughts you've got. So I'm just going to create a new demo map for BPS, as we would per usual. And actually, probably a good place to start is we're going to be focusing on Tim's family farm, so the founder of Land app's family farm, who I think recently both of you did a bit of a visit. So I suppose, how do you find, that initial process of welcoming a new client into the Ceres space and using the tool to deliver the advice.
We've done quite a few farm visits where you are going to, as part of the Farm Resilience Fund, going to a farm for the first time, having never been there before, and just by asking for their SBI number and entering it in, downloading land covers and maps, we're able to go to those meetings prepared with a map printed out, exactly showing all the parcels, how much permanent grassland, how much is arable. And just being able to print it out and scribble on it is very useful, which is something you can't do with the RPA website parcels very easily. So, it's very useful.
No, that's always good. And I think, credit to the RPA really for making it so accessible. However, what we're hoping is to build a tool around that infrastructure. It's not our data, it's data that belongs to the farmer, hosted by the RPA. And just to really talk through that workflow, because it is really key, especially with BPS, is you need an SBI number. As part of our end user license agreement, you agree to the terms that are under the RPA. So when you go through the RPA system, you have to accept those terms, and they're built into our end user license agreement. But basically, there's three main data sets that are available from the RPA. There's land covers, which is where your field parcels are split into the different components of land classification. So where the woodland is, where the arable land is, and where other features like farm buildings and tracks and hard standings are. Land parcels is kind of that one level up, which is just a catch-all field boundary that contains, field numbers and the area, like George just said, and then your hedge data, which does what it says on the tin, is hedges, but take it with a pinch of salt. We always say, it's not always correct, and I think it's just a good indicative value. And once you download those, just to really show you that workflow, is that they sit within your boundaries layer here. And George mentioned around getting that high-level summary of land use. Actually, if you click on each one of these, you get the breakdown of metadata. So on the right hand side, I've currently just clicked on one of the land parcels, which shows me this parcel ID is this big, the perimeter. And if I toggle off land parcels and click on that again, it then tells me from the land cover perspective what the land cover is as well. And really that first step in that understanding of that client, like you say, George, is understanding where they are, how big's their farm, what's currently registered, etc. I suppose maybe Robbie, in that process, do you use the data layers, for example? Is there any key data layers that you use within the Land App to give you a bit more context to what's happening within the farm?
Yeah, so one of the more useful data layers I've been using recently is the designation. So, for example, areas of outstanding national beauty or national parks. So if you can turn it on, you can see actually Tim's farm is right on the boundary of the Surrey Hills AONB, and that's been very useful. Again, before going to the farm, finding out if the farm does sit within or outside an AONB can open a few more doors in terms of grants, such as farming and protected landscapes. So that's certainly one of the more useful data layers I've been using. And then also the different map layers behind. So you've obviously got satellite option at the moment. Then you can also use OS leisure layers, etc. So yeah, just as you pull up there. So it's good to see things like public access, any bridleways or footpaths, and that sort of stuff.
Yeah, and it is worth saying on that point that all of the data layers that we host in the data layers tab are something called vector. And when we say vector, it means they're not only just the spatial overlay, you should be able to click on them and get a bit more information. So for example, with the public rights of way, if I click on them, it will tell me what type of access that is. So this is a footpath, for example, that goes through Tim's land. And the same with the AONB, that designation is, I can click on it, it tells me what it is, but there's also a hyperlink for more information about what that AONB means. So for your client, it might be you're working in different regions of the country all the time, you're trying to keep up with what designations mean. For example, if you want to do some reading on the Surrey Hills AONB, there's a direct link into some information there to hopefully make that process easier. But that's really useful. Any other data layers, George, you want to add to the mix?
Yeah, I mean, things like flood zones always pretty useful. When we're trying to think about wider either environmental or diversification options, plotting potential for new farm buildings or other projects. Clearly, flooding is quite a large planning restraint initially. So, yeah, it's quite a useful one.
Yeah. Great. So we were just having a bit of a discussion beforehand. There's a list longer than my arm of layers that we want to get in, but what we do really want to do is get the ones that are useful to you in. So if you're on this call and there's some data layers that you can't quite see in the Land app, do drop us a message, because we're trying to be as democratic as possible. If more and more people request the same layer, the more likely it's going to come in. So George, I can't remember what you just mentioned just before the call came on, but there's, just get in touch, and NDVI scores, those types of things are things that we can get in. If it's a geospatial layer, it's just that we need to just work out what's the most useful at this time of year. So we're really focusing on BPS stewardship, got the priority habitats coming in, some of the more water quality priority areas, for example. But yeah, we're really keen just to hear from you. So drop us a message, or on our website, there's a new form as well. No, that's really, really great. And just to really elaborate then on one next step, which is kind of the creating the BPS project. So we've downloaded the data, but when you first download the data sits in this locked section of the Land app map. And this is kind of uneditable, apart from one main feature that you can edit in here, which is the name of field parcels. So when it's in boundaries, you can see there's a little lock on here. And what you can do is you can give field names to the certain features. So for example, if your client, if I toggle off these ones just for now, if your client had a name, like a term for this big field here, I can click on it, it's highlighted orange, and I can rename that field to, Tim's big field, whatever it is. And that name will continue throughout all the projects that I'm creating. So if I'm creating a BPS and a countryside stewardship and an SFI template, Tim's big field will always have that as metadata from now on. And I'll just have that throughout the demo so you can see that one. So that it's always good to do that at the start, because retrospectively trying to do it for multiple projects can be quite difficult. But that's the only thing you can really edit in these boundaries. But once you've done that and you've named them, now you can get to that point of creating a project. Just to quickly show you that workflow, just then we can have a bit more of a conversation around basic payment, is we've got different templates, all have been fully formatted according to the schema they're using. So master map, baseline habitat is using UKHab. But today we're going to be talking about the basic payment scheme project. And what we recommend is you create your project from your land cover data. And the reason for that is it contains the information that you require for your basic payment, such as where there's grassland, where there's arable, etc. Just to show you, when I've chosen land covers and I've created a project, it extracts the land cover codes from your land cover data set. And it's now coloured in some of my features, not all of them, but my permanent grassland, for example, has been given a permanent grassland code, which is PG01, and it's being coloured in. Robbie, I'm not sure if you want to talk a bit more about that, that structure, and then kind of what you think the next steps are and how you use the land app from here.
Well, in terms of BPS, probably more George's George's area of expertise, but yeah, I mean, from this point, it's good to see which areas in terms of BPS claim are already in permanent grassland or temporary grassland.
Yeah, and it's where one of the ones that sometimes slips through down at this point to watch out for is woodland. Sometimes the woodland comes through and it's picked up as woodland. Sometimes it hasn't quite picked it up, and you have to. I like to flick on to Bing imagery and just quickly try and spot if there's any obvious bits of woodland that haven't been coloured into that dark green colour. You can see this. Tim hasn't got much woodland, but and quickly adjusting those to woodland can be quite useful at that stage.
Yeah, that's a really good point, and I think always every data import you do, especially with the RPA, it's up to you as either the client or the agent to make sure that data is correct. So there's a number of things you can do to ensure it is correct. I think the first thing is really anything that's got a red outline just hasn't been assigned a code. So for example, I think this is in Lucerne, is that right?
Yeah.
Lucerne. So I've clicked on an empty shape, and I can then hit the change button on the right hand side of my screen, and that gives me a full list of all the BPS codes that are available. So I can either go down and search for the Lucerne, or it's a lot easier if you just actually just use our search term and find the code. You don't need to, if you know the code is LG11, type in LG11, but if you don't, it's easier just to search for a keyword. But yeah, I think that first step of just sense checking what you've just downloaded is a really valuable piece.
A really good feature actually with changing the sort of field tag, as Dan's just done, is say you had 10 fields of winter wheat, for example, and they're all tagged the same. And for next year's rotation, that all of those fields are changing into a grass lay. You can actually, if you right click and select feature type, you can select all of those fields at one point. So as Dan just done, he selected all of the permanent grassland fields. And so not necessarily to do with BPS, but in terms of using the application for other uses like the rotation, you can select your entire block of wheat or your block of oilseed rape and change it for next year. So actually it's very good for sort of planning for the years ahead.
Yeah, great. Really good point, Robbie. Sorry, George.
And that's what we use the BPS layer probably more for sort of annual cropping maps that you can print out, throughout the year rather than just at this time of year helping with BPS applications.
Yeah. So I think, there's a lot of use cases for these, and I agree. Using the BPS one isn't just for BPSs; it's got all the crop codes. You use it cropping plans, and the functionality for that, select all, isn't just unique to BPS. Regardless of what project you're in, the functionality of the tool is exactly the same. So if you're doing a stewardship plan, you can select all of the AB8 flower margins, for example, and change the styling of those or reattribute those to a different code. So in this case, probably won't be changing all the permanent grassland, but as a demonstration, as Robbie said, I can right click, select them all, change the attribution, or I can change the styling. It might be that you want to make it slightly a different colored green, or use some artistic license to style it however you want. If in doubt and you feel like you make a mistake, don't panic. There is a good old fashioned undo button that just takes you back to those original states. You mentioned earlier, George, around the woodland creation. So let's just say for a hypothetical situation, actually, there was a missing woodland block here. What would be the process for you to, update that? Do you just hand draw it, or?
Yeah, it depends whether it's sort of already been mapped on Ordnance Survey or already been mapped on visible on aerial imagery. Often new things aren't. One of the downsides of the imagery here, of Bing imagery, is I found it's not quite as up to date as, for instance, Google can be. Maybe you already have the shape files from a newly planted bit of woodland, but if not, and perhaps it's visible on Google Earth, I sometimes go onto Google Earth Pro, draw around it, export as a KML, and then import that KML into the land app, and I've got a pretty accurate outline of it. Or similarly, could be taken from tractor GPS shapefiles.
Yeah. Okay. Well, a couple of points on that is basically the satellite imagery. At the moment, this Bing imagery can be in places 3 or 4 years old. We were in conversation with some providers, and I completely agree. We want to get some up-to-date aerial imagery, and I think there's two main avenues that we're exploring. And it'd be interesting to have people on the chat. What's more important if we had to choose one? And I think both would be best. Would you rather it to be slightly grainy but up to date more regularly, or a really high resolution one that could be 2 or 3 years old? So is it more important for that temporal element, up to date, or is it more important for the quality of the aerial? Because they're two kind of trade-offs that we have to make about getting the next data layer in. But I'd like to hope in the next 6 to 12 months both of them would be in. But at the moment we want to get one in. Is it aerial imagery that's could be up to 3 years old, but it's really crisp and you can see those margins perfectly, or is it roughly faintly see the new margin that was put in last couple of months? And on that, exporting, absolutely. Data created within the land app, you can export your data. So if you want to put it into another bit of software, absolutely fine. That's not on us to stop you doing that. So you can export it, whether that's to a QGIS or an ArcGIS or a Google Earth. There's 3 file types. I think a 4th one's coming soon, which is the DXF. So anyone doing CAD design, for example, for planning, that will come in. But hypothetically, then the workflow that you can do on the land app, if this was a woodland that you could see on the Bing imagery, and again, this is not there, you can either split that polygon off. So I can right click and click split, and you can either do it by dropping a series of points like this and get that like kind of rough edge with straight edges, sorry. Or if you do the same principle and hold the shift key, you can actually draw a freehand line, which is as good as my shaky hand will do. So you can get, those 2 separate ways of cutting it. And now my polygon, which was originally 2 bits of grass, 1 bit of grass, is being split into 2. The metadata stayed the same. So the field ID, sheet ID is the same, but now I can attribute that part of the permanent grass to a separate BPS code like woodland. Really
It's
good
probably
value.
quite useful, Dan, to show quite often things where we're planting new belts of trees, they're probably set 24-meter sort of belts. And so on one of the larger fields, either drawing a line and adding a buffer, or adding the buffer set it to 24 meters is a pretty useful, quick way of splitting those out.
Yeah, really good point. So just to show you that, so that, yeah, there's two ways you can add a buffer on the land app. The first one is kind of a catch-all for the whole field. We've got this buffer tool, and then you can choose side one is the outside. So that could be, say, putting a buffer around a pond, or side two in this case is what you want, which is putting a buffer around the inside of a field. And you can add a 24-meter buffer. It automatically adds that. You can tidy up the edges. So I think if I hit round corners, you can see it's gone a bit more natural on that edge. And then you can subtract, which will just minus the area of that buffer from the interior field. So the area of the lucerne is now reduced to kind of accommodate for this. And again, you can give that a code, or the other, I mean, you're probably not going to be planting a full woodland around the outside, but just to continue that demo is that if you did want to just a partial field edge going into a buffer, yeah, as George said, if you draw a line to start with, that line can then snap to the edge of the field parcel like so. Once you're happy with where it is, double click and finish, and then exactly the same again, use that buffer tool to add a buffer.
Or sometimes even drawing the line slightly inside the edge of the boundary, because there might be a track or gap between the hedge and the boundary.
So you can pick that line up and move it like so. And then, yeah, what I would probably do is tidy up this edge before I do anything. So if you hold A on your keyboard, you can minus it off, and then, yeah, let's add a buffer to that. Good point. There we are. So there's a woodland that's floating that's 24 meters wide that I can then use like so. Absolutely. And it was worth saying, we'll kind of come on to this in the end, is as we're drawing this, a number of things are happening in the background. It's not just creating a map. The map is kind of a tool of getting to the main output, which is a detailed table view. And so just to quickly show you, as we've been adding, and we'll come back to this a bit later, is as we're drawing all these different shapes, it's populating what is an Excel spreadsheet export. So you can see a breakdown of all the field numbers and names if you've added a name. So Tim's big field is the one at the bottom of the list, but then it's breaking down that field into the various codes that make it up. So as we develop this BPS project, this will get more detailed, and that's the real actual value you're trying to get from this. Although the pretty map's useful and can be used as a good communication tool for your BPS submission, which we'll come on to, it's the true values of those options that you need to claim for. Do you, in terms of getting ready a map for a client, do you use labels? Do you print with? Is there anything you want to explore on that? Quickly demo the label function, for example.
Yeah, I would tend to, depending on what it's for, tend to flick on the parcel numbers, parcel areas, and yes, if it's things like cropping maps, then field names as well, which presumably would have put. I wasn't aware of that labeling names within the boundaries land cover. So yeah, that will definitely be useful. Presumably it would feed through now to your name to be able to turn on.
Yeah. So that land cover name that's in here is a description. Everything in here is carried through. So the description is permanent grassland in there. And so now within here, my description stays the same. Yeah, but that's constant. So if, in this example, it says it was arable land, but the woodland block that I've also drawn in that arable land is still arable land. So do take that label with a pinch of salt. That's not dynamic, but yeah, that's quite a nice additional use of those labels. So yeah, and the same principle, Robbie, I know you mentioned the select all, of a certain feature type, but just to flag up that you can actually select everything within a project as well. So if I wanted to turn on all the labels for every option, for example, I can select all of these, or it might be that I just want to select just the field parcels like so, and then I can actually bulk turn on all the areas, all the parcel IDs and all the descriptions, for example.
Slightly quicker if you've got 100 fields to label.
Yeah, especially with the diverse cropping that I'm sure you guys are used to. When you've got lots of rotations, lots of different codes, sometimes selecting that feature type isn't quite as quick as it could be to select them all.
Yeah,
like so. Great. So yeah, we're going to next talk about, in terms of the collaborative element of the land app. So we've been designing a bit of a plan here. Robbie or George, are you using the collaborate function, and if so, in what sense?
Yes, so it's very useful that it's one sort of master map that two different colleagues from two different offices can log on and see the same thing. And then, yes, more recently starting to share those maps that we've drawn with the farmers, with clients themselves, so that they can see where we've measured out countryside stewardship options. They can log on and sort of see that, or indeed make changes if things have moved. And so sort of working together with one master version is very useful. You haven't got sort of endless out of date versions. You've got one live map.
Yeah. And we've in the software, we've got 3 different levels of permission. Just out of interest, if you were working with a random client, say Tim, do you give them just read only, or do you let them edit?
Yeah. Well, if it were Tim, probably read only, but I tend to give edit and then let people know that if you change something, this is the master version. Otherwise, you would just end up with something that you'd need 2 because they wouldn't be able to edit. But yeah, it is important to sort of say if you delete something, it's deleted.
Yeah, that's true. I think it's interesting to see how the different agents behave, because I think there's benefits from giving people editorial permissions, but then there's a risk with it as well. And I think what we're trying to promote isn't perfect maps, but I think as accurate as we can get them. But it's almost like the value of engaging the client in the process is almost more valuable than the map being perfect. So if they do accidentally draw the hedge incorrectly, or delete a field, or move the lapwing plot to the left, it's more about engaging the client, or engaging your estate team if you're an estate manager in the process. And I think this collaborative element, which is a bit like Google Sheets, people can come in and view, collaborate in real time, is just a really nice asset that makes the mapping a bit more engaging. Just as a note on a bit of admin, that if I retrospectively don't want Tim or Tom to see my map, I can easily remove them or change their permission, and that's instantaneous. So if you've got someone who's editing and they're causing chaos, you can just come in and change them to read only if you want, or remove them, and that eliminates them from that map. So whoever creates the map is the true owner, and they can therefore dictate who's invited, who can collaborate. And just to really touch on, I'm not sure if George, you're using the publisher function yet, or Robbie?
No, not yet.
No. If there's time, we can come on it, but we've released a 3rd level of permission, which gives that collaborator permission to aggregate or export that data from the land app. So we've got an API service, for example. If you invite someone in as a publisher, their API can actually access that data. So it might be that you're working with a farmer that's already got a map, but you want your API to include their map. That one source of truth principle can continue if they invite you as a publisher. Great. So yeah, that's that type of collaboration. And really, just to touch on it as well, this is just one map, and just to kind of show you my dashboard, is that at a team level, I can collaborate with my team. So this is me and all my land app demos that I'm doing with Tim and Tom and the rest of the guys. But if you're an agency or even an estate, collaboration doesn't just have to happen on one map. It can happen across a series of maps that could be, filed away in a neat, nice way. So if I just wanted to see all the maps that I'm working on the farming, everyone who's working on farming or within the Southwest, that can go through that process. Great. So we're about halfway through. We've started creating a map. Say now for actual Tim's farm, and Robbie, I don't know if you want to take this one. What's left to do on this map before it's getting ready for submission? So there's, we can talk a bit about hedgerow data, for example, talk about tidying it up. Is there anything else that you consider when creating that map?
In terms of BPS, or?
Well, just generally, if you've got thoughts about anywhere else.
With Tim's, for example, so we just sort of set the scene with George and my involvement. We, as we said, we've been along and we've carried out this sort of farm business review, and through that we've highlighted different areas of the farm that Tim's interested in, as are other members of his family. And so we highlighted things such as biodiversity net gain, so the area in sort of southeast corner along the river. That's it's not a productive area in terms of from a farming point of view. So it's been good to highlight different areas of the farm as well, going back to the sort of flood risk and things like that. George, I'm not sure if you've got anything else you want to add on.
Yeah, I mean, this is clearly quite a straightforward BPS application, given its size and sort of land covers. But normally it would be cross-checking really with any countryside stewardship options that are available, making sure we know where those are, and it's a useful sort of time of year to audit areas and sizes for those as well, for rotational options, knowing which field those rotational options are going to be in this year, and so mapping those on at this stage can be pretty useful.
Yeah, and actually that's probably quite a nice place just to quickly demo is what we recommend is get your BPS as accurate as you can. So, just to clarify, this isn't actually a woodland, so I can merge those back together. Make sure you're happy you've added some woodland, and it might be that they've missed off an area of scrub down here. But once you've got that map correct, you can actually duplicate it to a countryside stewardship, and then start planning some stewardship options as well. So it might not be that you're just doing BPS in isolation with the client, but once you've created that plan or that BPS that's correct, I'm just going to tidy it up a little bit, you can actually duplicate that project. So rather than starting afresh with the RPA's map that you've created, I can duplicate my basic payment scheme into the CS countryside stewardship template. And we've had previous webinars, and I think we've got one coming up on stewardship itself, but now I can use the shapes created in that BPS for my stewardship plan. So for example, that woodland block that I drew might be going into a woodland improvement option, for example, and therefore you can use those same shapes that you've drawn, scrub management, and just having that as a central point, scrub control, for example, is actually overlaid.
It's probably worth saying at this point as well that it's a very good time if you are thinking of applying for countryside stewardship later this year, that ensuring your land covers are correct at the moment. And a common mistake is people assume that if the RPA had incorrectly placed land with a permanent grassland land cover, and last year you said, no, it's not permanent grassland, it's wheat, so I've claimed it as wheat. You'll notice each year it keeps coming back as permanent grassland, and that's because the RPA won't automatically update land covers based on what option code you claim on it. You unfortunately have to physically do an RLE1 form to change the land cover. But it's particularly important to be doing that now at this time of year if you are likely to be applying for countryside stewardship, because you, for instance, wouldn't want to request your countryside stewardship application pack and it come with lots of permanent grassland on it, which isn't actually permanent grassland, it's arable, or indeed vice versa, because it's going to limit the options you can place on them.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And shall we quickly just talk through how do you actually have to use the land app for that RLE1, or are you still doing it manual or another way?
With something as simple as a land cover, the RLE1 is just a case of the text on it is just change land cover. So depending on the scale, if it's just one field, I would probably just print out the RPA's plan. But yeah, if it's multiple, land app may well be easier.
Yeah. So you just, if anyone was wanting to use it, we've got a template for RLE1s. You can just copy the feature. So let's just say, for example, in George's case, that this was actually arable and I wanted to put some arable options on it this year, but it's currently the land cover is down as permanent grassland. You can use this to evidence, to create a map. And I think you need the parcel ID number. You need what is going from and to, and the total area that's involved in that transition. And I think there's a couple of styling on here. Basically, you can say whether that's the parcels, you've got all your field parcels, and then printing this off and submitting that. You just need a physical map. So if it's just one polygon, it might be easier to hand draw it. But say you're handling a client that's got 30 changes across an estate, you can copy those just the features that are relevant onto an RLE1 project and label them like so, and then print that off as part of your evidence base. But yeah, the RLE1's relatively simple, but unfortunately it's quite bureaucratic. So you just need to, tick tick the boxes, fill out the form on the RPA from the RPA's website, and submit that as a change log. Be a really good point and good tip to get that in early.
And things for boundary changes and things, it's very useful at this stage of an application to be flicking on the land registry ownership layer as well. A number of times you turn on land registry, and with BPS turned on as well, and you notice that perhaps corners of fields aren't registered, or it's a very useful way to sort of check discrepancies between the two. And it may be, for instance, if that corner you've just highlighted is in fact owned by the farm, it's not registered on the RPA, now would be a good time to be doing an RLE1 form to register that bit of woodland onto the farm, and making sure that your RPA maps are as accurate as possible for any future scheme or option that might be available on that.
Yeah, and just to quickly talk you through that workflow, how LandLab can help. So I've selected this random appendix of woodland. I right click and copy it to my RLE1 form. When it's on the RLE1 form, what you need to do is if you're registering something new, you need to give it a field number. And we've actually got a tool that can automatically calculate the field number for you. So I've got this polygon. If I turn off basic payment and I turn off land registry, this is my new woodland block. If I click this coordinates button at the bottom right hand side of the screen, I've got 3 different coordinates. So we've actually got 3 words coming as well as the fourth. The center point, which is this little X in the middle, is given the national grid field number of SU 9443005. So that's what they need.
That is very useful. We used to spend years going to sort of grid reference finder websites and always getting the different 6-figure grid references the wrong way around. So having a system that finds a center of a parcel and gives you that code is very helpful.
Yeah. So as part of your RLE1, then the points you need are pretty much the size, this, and then also I think you need to have a description, a code of what it is. So that is all the information the RPA needs for a nice, an RLE1 of something new. So if I put a slightly bigger border around it, you just need to print that off. That's all they need and fill out a form. Perfect. Well, that's really useful. And do remember the Q&A function is on the bottom of your screen. Is there anything you want us to recap that we've just discussed? I'm just looking at my script, unless Robbie or George, there's anything you want to cover while I'm just finding my place.
I think all I'd add is that that I've been working with Ceres Rural for the last sort of 8 months, and I've started using LandLab at the start of my time there, and I find it very sort of intuitive and easy to use, and there are lots of different features that I'm not yet using, and even today I found out a few more. But I'd say that BPS would be a great place to start with using the Land app. And as George was saying, with if you do have a CSS application coming up in the coming months, it's sort of a good stepping stone towards helping out with your CSS or RLE1 applications as well as. So yeah, it's very intuitive and very, very useful for lots of different reasons.
Yeah, great. Thanks for that. Really, that's all we're really wanting to do, is we're not trying to overcomplicate anything. These submissions are meant to be relatively straightforward, but it can be that the admin of the application, especially if you're handling multiple, can be difficult. So hopefully the tool is useful as it is, but if there's anything that we can do to improve, do let us know as well. Just one final point on the basic payment before we really come on to that submission process, George, was just around the hedgerows. George, maybe if you could just remind me mainly, and anyone else listening, what changes have happened to ecological focus areas? Are they still required, or is just cross compliance?
No, so that's been really simplified down. So fortunately, hedgerows are just a cross compliance requirement, but also, or probably more commonly now, a countryside stewardship requirement. And even if you don't have any hedgerow options on your hedges, e.g. enhanced hedgerow management, it is a prerequisite of all countryside stewardship agreements to be cutting hedgerows every other year and complying with the cutting dates, so not before 1st of September. So unfortunately, the oilseed rape derogation that was there, or that is there, isn't applicable if you are in any countryside stewardship agreement. So yeah, it's quite useful having a map of hedgerows, and then I like to print that off, and then with the farmer sort of highlight, this year we're going to cut these hedges, next year we're going to cut these hedges, and it's quite nice to have a sort of a map in the farm office so that you know which hedges to cut each year.
Yeah, okay, that's a really nice point, and I'm not sure if anyone watching might have missed that, but basically what I've done is I've brought down the hedgerow data from the boundary section to my projects by just creating a new basic payment, but instead of choosing land covers, I chose the hedgerow data, and that kind of plonked the hedges onto my map, and then I've just restyled them by selecting them and turning them yellow. And I think, George, your point is that, you know, that hedgerow data, although for the application you don't need it for that ecological focus areas, knowing where your hedges are and making sure they're mapped correctly has lots of subsequent benefits, whether it's stewardship, whether it's looking down in the future in terms of ELMs. So actually, George, just to go on that thread, and tell me if I'm wrong, is so you'd say these are Tim's hedges, and actually let's just make this one a slightly more.
They are often incorrect, the RPA hedges, and it is. There's a question comes through on the Q&A about doing an RLE1 for hedges if you're claiming BE3, and the answer is that if you are claiming BE3 on countryside stewardship, the lengths do need to be mapped on the RPA's hedge layer, so the two do need to correspond. But you can either, as Dan is doing, map them like this and submit this map as an RLE1, or it is also possible, sorry Dan, to use your paper countryside stewardship options or FER maps as a hedgerow map, to send that in as an RLE1 to update that hedge data layer on the RPA. So either or, I suppose, depending which one you're doing first.
Yeah, and obviously love the paper map, but if anyone wants to do the digital submission, just to show you that you can also trace existing features. So if you've got Ordnance Survey credits, I can actually say on my RLE1, I can turn on the interactive map for this OS, and I can draw a hedge line that traces the existing master map. So let's say, for hypothetical sake, I've got a new hedgerow around here. What I can do is I can draw a line that's tracing that master map feature. And so on my RLE1 project, you know, I've got that hedge drawn, but it's traced the master map rather than having to manually try and draw it to follow the boundary. And that works as the same as trying to trace existing features on your map as well. So, you know, you can trace that green RLE1, and I've drawn my new hedge.
Yeah, that's very useful.
We can then give a line, or, you know, say what the feature is, its total length. But yeah, just making, especially being slightly proactive and forward thinking, okay, what stewardship options am I putting in? Are they actually representing the RPA correctly? Will save you a lot of admin later down the line. So yeah, do a paper map, do the interactive map, you know, as long as they're being updated, it's, you know, it's good. Hopefully by next year, when you download it, everything would have updated based on your RLE1s. Robbie, kind of question to you is, let's hypothetically say you're doing a BPS and you're on your own and you get stuck. What's your kind of first port of call? How do you get assistance?
Well, I'd probably first off I'd ask a colleague, but if I was sort of a farmer on my own, then I'd, you know, the chat function in the land app's very useful for bouncing off questions. And yeah, I mean, over the last few months, you guys have been very sort of prompt in terms of response on that. And as I've said, it is a very intuitive application to use, but there are so many features that are out there that are useful that, you know, you need to sort of go out of your way to find. So yeah, giving you guys a message on the chat function is a very sort of quick and easy way to get a fast response, and that will essentially save you a lot of time.
Yeah. I didn't know about that OS Snap 2 feature, Dan, so I've learned something. There's a lot of features that that are there that you may not be using. Yeah.
Well, great to hear. And Robbie, back to your first point, I wouldn't discredit asking your friends. You know, just, you know, this is a collaborative. There's mainly Simla and Tom manning this chat function. Really happy to help. There's a huge amount of help guidance as well. So I think if you, I don't know, snap to line, if I search that, how to work interactive ordnance survey snap to line function, there's a bit of guidance on, you know, how you can do that, a bit of video on the same farm I am on at the moment. But yeah, just about those little functions. We're trying as best, and Tom's leading the charge advertising all these new product functions. But yeah, hopefully, joining these webinars, it's great to hear George, who's advocate of LandApp, is still learning new things, and there is product updates happening most weeks now, and we try and keep you all updated about
actually seeing what you've just flagged up there, Dan. There's also a lot of videos on YouTube, not just the one you flagged up, but YouTube's also a good port of call for any queries you've got.
Yeah, I think on the follow-up email, there'll be a link to our YouTube channel. Do have a look on there. There's previous webinars we've done, there's loads of help and guidance, and there's case studies coming through as well. How are different user groups using the LandApp from start to finish. So yeah, do just have a little search. Hopefully we can find what you need help with. But like you said at the start there, Robbie, we're always happy to answer the messages. So you can send us a live chat. I think Similar's got the average response down to 7 minutes at the moment. So we're really trying to be on top of those queries. But yeah, do try and use the guidance where you can rather than just relying on Similar. But she is there to help. Okay, so kind of for the final 5 minutes before we get on to Q&A, I just want to talk about what's the future. Where are we going, George? We've got BPS phasing out. What would you say to the people listening is the best next step they can do to prepare themselves?
Yeah, so the sustainable farming incentive is the soil standard is going to be live this year. It's obviously being piloted at the moment, but the applications are going to be coming out in April, I believe, and should be available. That should be money coming into bank accounts in December. So whilst it's a sort of if your previous basic payment was £40,000, your payment this year is likely to be down to £31,000. So it's sort of a £50 a hectare drop. But if you can suit the requirements of the sustainable farming incentive soil standard, it could be £40 a hectare this year. So helping to mitigate that BPS reduction. The other the sort of common option we are seeing a lot of is countryside stewardship. If you're not already in one, or your HLS is about to expire, then it can be a useful way to be sort of rethinking a farm strategy and deploying countryside stewardship options appropriately to sort of change that farming strategy.
Yeah, really, really good point. And I think the simple answer is there isn't one route forward, and it's really working out what works for you. And obviously getting advice is a really good way of doing it. Planning scenarios is another way you can do it. And just to flag up just in the last couple of minutes, we've obviously got the stewardship template. We have also released a beta version of a sustainable farming incentive template, which is based on the existing prices. So George mentioned £40 a hectare. So just to show you that works in exactly the same way as stewardship, apart from when I click on a feature, I'm met with the different standards under the SFI. So you mentioned the soil standard. So I'm putting this into an arable soil standard. It's got the guidance in there. And actually, if I put these ones into some grass standard of some sort, grass aversion, soil management, lots of different ones. But for example, there is guidance sheets linked in, just like stewardship, to payment rates, etc. So what's expected for that improved grass standard. Plus, as part of that table view export, there should be the payment rates as well. So yeah, here we go. So the soil standard for arable is £41 per hectare. So what you can do is you can do a scenario for stewardship, and you can do a scenario for SFI, and you can appraise the different options as well. So you can draft up if you went down the SFI route. Stupid question maybe, George, can you do SFI in parallel to stewardship? Can you do half your farm in one?
You can actually overlay both if they are not competing standards as well. So yes, you could do half and half. Probably if you are in a normal countryside stewardship agreement with sort of margins and grassland, etc., it is possible to overlay the sustainable farming incentive soil standard onto your countryside stewardship, because they'll essentially be paying for separate things. So yeah, it is possible to be doing both.
Okay, great. Well, I think if anyone's out there wanting to do that, I would give it a try, do some reading, or get in touch with either Ceres or other agencies to get some advice. Perfect. Well, what I'm going to do is, we've got 10 minutes left until 2 o'clock. I can see the chat and the Q&As running through. So Tom, if you want to come and lead the Q&A function, I'd be more than grateful, and we can try and answer the questions that come.
very, very big thank you to George and Robbie for coming on the call,
Pleasure.
giving up their time. I think everyone really appreciates it when they can actually, get some advice from you guys who are the experts and lead the way on this kind of thing. So thank you very much.
Yeah, no worries.
Great. Thank you so much, guys. And thanks, Tom, for organizing it. I'll stay on for another 2 or 3 minutes if anyone wants to stay, but other than that, pleasure to have you here.